Hi, my name is Jamie Fournier, and this is my third performance, and it's a story edit. It's a literary fairy tale called A Toy Princess by Mary de Morgan, and I chose it for an adult audience because it's a very long, intricate story, which I've pared down. And she was a suffragette. Her story, she wrote a variety of fairy tales, and they're just not as well known as, say, people that she influenced, like Hans Christian Andersen. So I always thought of it as a fun program for adults where you wanted to recover some of the lost tales of some of our female writers. And here it goes, A Toy Princess. In a land far, far away, a long time ago, there lived a kingdom. And this kingdom was known for being extremely polite. The people rarely ever spoke to each other, they were so polite. In fact, there's really only a few things that you really needed to say to one another, such as, of course, certainly, if you please, thank you, and just so. Now, it was the rudest thing ever for anyone to show what they liked or disliked, loved or hated, if they were sad or happy. In fact, there was no laughing out loud, and no one ever would be seen crying in public, for if they did, they'd be shunned by all their friends. No, this was not a kingdom where one showed their emotions. The king had decided that he wanted to marry, and he chose this beautiful, lovely woman from a neighboring kingdom. However, her kingdom could not have been further from his. Their people were loud and were noisy, and they were shouted, and they laughed when they were happy, and they cried and they lamented when they were sad. And basically whatever they felt, they just showed it on their face. Now, needless to say, she had some adjusting to do when she arrived to her new kingdom, for she couldn't figure out what was wrong with her subjects. There was no cheering to welcome her. First, she just found them stiff and formal and distant, and she thought that they'd eventually warm up. But as time grew on, she realized this was just how they were. They were just very distant and formal and quiet, and this made her so sad, because she longed and yearned for her own kingdom, her own people, where they were happy and where she could be herself. Well, over time, she grew very thin, and she grew very pale, to the point where she looked extremely ill. But everyone was way too polite to show that they thought there was something wrong with the queen. One day she thought that she was dying, and so she called to her fairy godmother Tapare to come for a visit. Now, they had a private conversation, and no one knows what was said, but shortly after, she did give birth to a little girl, and then the queen died. Well, everyone felt horrible for the queen's death, but they were way too polite to show it. So they had their formal funeral, and they had a day of mourning, but after that, everything pretty much went on as it always had. The little girl was christened as Ursula and was given to the highest ladies of the court and their nurses to be taken care of. Well, the baby cried and cried and cried. She cried when she was hungry, and she cried when she was cold, and eventually she started to even coo when she was happy. The ladies were frustrated, for they'd never heard such a dreadful sound in such a long time, and they didn't know how to calm her down. Well, by the time she was around 2, she began to kind of realize what they meant when they said in cold, polite terms, "You're naughty." And so she began to withdraw and get quieter. She had a grand nursery. It was a phenomenal room, but she had no toys. There were no games. No one played with her. She was not allowed to have any friends over, for in case she might pick up a bad manner or two. So most days she just put her hand on her chin and she looked out the window, watching the birds fly by. Well, this one day, Tapare decided that she was going to fly in and just see how things were getting on. And to her dismay, she saw the poor little princess looking out the window, and there was not a toy in the room to be found. This made her shake her head and very upset. But then she heard a nurse call, "Your Royal Highness, dinner is served." And the little girl Ursula, without even turning her head, said, "I don't want any dinner today." "Well, your Royal Highness, I believe we've been through this, how very rude it is to show what you like or dislike. Now dinner is served." Tapare studied this interaction, and then she followed the little girl to the dining room, and she watched, and she was more horrified than she was in the nursery, for there the little girl sat and barely ate a bite, and no one noticed. There was no talking, there was no laughing, there was nothing. And then she looked at her and she realized that she was getting pale and thin and looked very much like her mother. Well, that was enough for Tapare. She flew out of that place and she went back to Fairyland with a plan in mind, and she walked into a magic store where the shopkeeper happened to be a wizard. Well, he saw his best customer and he rushed over and said, "Madame, Madame, what can I do for you?" To which she said, "I need a princess. Not just any princess. She must be around 6. She must grow. And she must look like this," to which she handed over to the shopkeeper a portrait of the little Princess Ursula. He studied it, he put his glasses on, looked it up and down and said, "Princess you want, princess you shall have. However, it's the voice. It's always the voice that's the hardest." Tapperée smiled and said, "No need to concern yourself with that. She mustn't be very talkative at all. In fact, she really only needs to say, 'Of course,' 'Certainly,' 'If you please,' 'Just so,' and 'Thank you.' What, is that all? It'll be done by tonight." So Tapperée waited, and then slowly the wizard came out, holding the hand of a small little princess that looked exactly like Tapperée, or looked exactly like Ursula. She looked down and studied her one way and studied her another way, for she had to last for a very long time. She looked quite right, so Ursula paid for the toy princess, put her under her arm, and went off back to the palace. And there she saw the little princess looking out at the moon, crying. And then she noticed that she took her nightgown and she went like this to wipe those tears as fast as she could. And then she heard the little princess say, "Oh, dear moon, how I wish I could live with you, for it looks as if you would be allowed to cry whenever you please." This broke Tapperée's heart, and she said, "I'll take you." To which the little girl turned around and saw this funny old lady sitting beside her with these big brown eyes, and she felt so safe. She said, "Well, where would you take me?" "To the sea, where you would run and you would make noise and you could laugh and play with other children your age." "Oh, take me," said the little girl. Well, Ursula picked her up and put her under her arm and went off. And they flew above the rooftops, and they flew, and they flew, and they flew, for it was a very long way to the sea. And when they got there, there was a small little cottage that was owned by Mark, a fisherman, and his wife and 3 children, Philip, Oliver, and little Belle. Now they did not have much money, for they only lived off the fish that their father caught for them, but they were happy. And so the fairy godmother placed Ursula by the doorstep, and then she picked up her wand and she created a big gust of wind that opened the door of the cottage. Well, the wife stood up and went over to shut it and looked down, and there was Ursula, the beautiful little princess. Well, she looked just about the same age as her own daughter, and she scooped her up. She brought her in, put blankets around her by the fire, and gave her warm milk and bread. And little Ursula had no memory of what had happened or how she got there. Well, the fisherman and his wife agreed that if anyone would claim her, obviously they would give her back. But if no one did, they would raise her as their own. And so they did. Years went on, and Ursula would just run up and down the seashore with her brothers and sisters and friends, and she laughed and she played and she went to school, and eventually she even started to take care of Mark and his wife as they got older. Well, meanwhile, over in the palace, the very first day that the ladies of the court went in to wake up their princess, who they thought was just Ursula but was in fact the toy, was the best day ever, for they woke and she woken. And then they put a dress on her and she said, "Certainly," and then not a word for the rest of the day. Well, as the princess grew, so did the toy princess, and the toy princess became beautiful and lovely, and only said those 5 little words that to everyone was the pinnacle of politeness. Why, it was around the kingdom that there was never a more beautiful or more polite girl ever, and this brought great joy to the king's heart. Well, often Tapperée would come and look in on Ursula and the fisherman and see how life was, and she always felt so happy that she'd saved her from this dreadful life. But as she noticed Mark and the fisherman's wife were getting much older, she thought, probably the king is too, and she thought she should check on him. When she did, she entered right during a council meeting where they were deciding to hand over the rulership of the kingdom to their daughter, who was the toy princess. Well, Tapperée made herself visible at once and looked at the king, and the king was so happy to see her and said, "Oh, you've come at the right time. We were just deciding what we should do with our power and our reign." Tapperée quickly got him and said, "We need to speak," and she told him everything. he was beside himself. He could not talk. He was almost crying. He was trembled. Everyone that was watching was looking and couldn't figure out what this inappropriate behavior was. He couldn't even get the words out. Tabaret came back and looked at them all and said, "There are two princesses, and I've switched them. The real one has lived somewhere else. You have a sham, a toy, a fake one." Well, the Prime Minister said, "Impossible, for we love our dear princess." And the Chancellor did not believe and could not even understand why we would listen to such a person. Tabaret did not suffer fools, so she summoned the toy princess, which they brought out and stood. Of course, she didn't speak because she hadn't been spoken to. And like a good princess, she just stayed there. Tabaret waved her wand and flung it, and the head of the toy princess shot up, turned around, and bounced on the floor, and it rolled. And as it hit the floor, it said, "Just so." And everyone in the crowd was horrified. They didn't know what to make of this. They could clearly see that the princess that they had loved was, in fact, a shell. There was nothing in her. She was a toy. Well, Tabaret said, don't worry, the real princess is here." And she brought Ursula forth. And she said, "Here is your real daughter, your real princess. Your flesh and blood daughter is right here." Well, they were still all upset over the toy head being rolled away and didn't know what to do. Well, Ursula saw her father, and she ran to him, and she put her arms around him, and she kissed him on the cheek, and she looked up into his eyes, and he stood there, stiff as a board. And she looked around, and everyone's eyes were up and down and darting around and not looking at anyone. And she knew she did something wrong, but what? So then she looked, and she said, "Did I kiss the wrong person?" Which was even worse, because more eyes started to dart, and no one understood this awkward behavior. Well, she got nervous, and then she got more scared, and then she burst into tears, which everyone huffed and puffed and tried to ignore, for what was this display of emotion? She did not know what she had done wrong, so she ran off. Tabaret was getting very frustrated with him and said, "This is your daughter. Are you not happy to see her?" The king sighed, and finally Tabaret said, "Look, you have a week to get to know her. I will come back, and if at that time you decide that you want your toy princess as opposed to your real breathing daughter, then so be it." A week passed. Tabaret returned and found the real princess, sad and thin and pale, and she looked at the court and said, "What have you done to your real princess?" And everyone sighed, and she said, "Well, I would think the decision would be very easy for you, that you would want your real life daughter, but if you choose your toy princess, so be it." Well, the king, he hummed and he hawed and he sighed, and he could not make his decision, so he asked for the wise councilmen to take a vote. Not one vote was cast for the real princess. They all wanted the sham, the fake. Tabaret asked for the toy princess to be brought forward, and they brought her body and her head, and then with a wave of wand, the head bounced up, went on, and adhered magically to the rest of the body, and the head turned around and said, "Certainly." And the crowd almost applauded, and there was almost a cheerful, a joyful stance, but they held it tight. And then Tabaret looked at them and said, "This is what you've chosen, a toy to be your ruler." And they all agreed. She said, "You silly fools, be done with you." And she scooped up Ursula, put her under her arm, and flew her back to the fisherman's cottage, where she married Oliver and lived happily ever after by the sea. Thank you.